British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said that his government stands ready to apply more draconian virus restrictions if necessary, but in collaboration with local leaders at a regional level. He was speaking at a press conference earlier on. The Prime Minister said that the tier-based system offered a chance to get R down. Stuart Smith is our correspondent in London. He joins us now. So, Stuart, what exactly does that mean, a chance to get R down and the collaboration with regional leaders? How does he foresee that happening?
Well, getting R down means getting the rate of infection down across the country. Of course, lower rate of infection, less risk to people. At the moment, that R rate is between 1.3 and 1.5. Compare that to earlier in the peak of the pandemic, earlier in the year, that was at 3. So not as bad as that in terms of rate of infection, but there is a big problem for Mr. Johnson right now. Indeed, like you say, he wants consensus amongst local leaders to institute this new tiered plan. Tiered system means if a local authority has a high rate of infection, there are particular rules it has to follow. A low rate of infection, a particular set of rules. But the Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham, does not want to enter Tier 3. That's the highest tier with the highest risk of infection. And although his area, Greater Manchester, has a very high rate of infection, he's refusing to accept Tier 3 lockdown conditions. The reason, he says, is because, one, it would have a devastating impact on Manchester's local economy, but also he thinks in Manchester, the virus is not being spread in businesses, and Tier 3 lockdown restrictions place a lot of extra measures on businesses. So he's questioning whether it's a right move for Manchester and also whether it would even make any difference. Manchester has been under its own local lockdown conditions for months, much longer than the rest of the country, and it doesn't seem to have make any difference there. So he's arguing with Boris Johnson about whether to institute these extra measures.
And just looking at the figures today, Stuart, 15,650, that's how many new cases were reported of coronavirus in the UK. And the Prime Minister is seeming to suggest that the sooner you clamp down on it, then you are better off as a country. Are people responsive to this message? Do they realize that there is a need to restrict movement even further?
Not necessarily is the simplest way to put it, because Boris Johnson, his own government, is not necessarily implementing a national lockdown, which would be the quickest way to reduce the rate of infection. That's what the opposition Labour Party is calling for. But Boris Johnson says that's not a fair way of doing this. There are parts of the country which still have a much lower rate of infection, which don't even need the mildest tier of lockdown restrictions, and it would have a devastating effect on the economy. So Boris Johnson certainly wants to keep a more measured approach, balancing the economy with the health of the country by going for this tiered system of local lockdowns. But people are certainly losing their tether, and in Manchester and Northwest especially, these people have been under extra restrictions for months, and the situation does not seem to be getting any better, which is frustrating leaders and frustrating residents in the northwest of England.
So practically, what does it mean for those that are worst affected in terms of public places like schools, like we've seen in the past that have been shut down, churches, gyms, etc., restaurants?
Yeah, compare it to the national lockdown. Even the highest restrictions in Tier 3 are not nearly as extreme. There is still the option to go to weddings, to go to funerals, and most importantly for the government, schools and universities are still open. What you get with Tier 3 restrictions is a lot more rules about who you can see and where you can see them. Tier 3, you can't see anyone outside your own household, either in your home or in a garden, and there are still rules about how many people you can see outside your home. In terms of businesses, an interesting rule here, if you want to enter a pub or a restaurant, your primary purpose to visit has to be for a meal. It cannot be for drinks. So there will be a lot of people out in the cold drinking in open spaces if they do want to get their fix of alcohol with other people in their social group. So it's a mixture of social restrictions and business restrictions, and a few extra places like gyms and leisure centres are forced to close. Those places with the highest risk of infection.
And just from the previous time, the rates of infections were higher among older teenagers and younger adults. So is that the case now? Is that what we're seeing, some of those infections, or has the pattern changed?
The highest rate of infection is indeed amongst teenagers and also children between the ages of 0 and 10, also seeing the highest infection rate. Why that is, it's not clear. There is no one answer to why that is. Earlier in the year, perhaps it was because people were going out for parties, but certainly now with these local restrictions, nightclubs still closed and pubs having extra restrictions, that wouldn't seem to be the main reason anymore. So epidemiologists still not sure exactly why that is the case. An interesting statistic on top of that, although the rate of infection is still much lower than earlier in the pandemic at only 1.5, one person spreading it to 1.5 people, there is the highest number of people in intensive care, a higher number of people in intensive care right now than compared to when the country went into lockdown earlier in the year. So that really does highlight that the UK is in quite a serious situation right now.
Well, thanks a lot, Stuart. Stuart Smith, our correspondent in London. Europe experiencing a second wave, and some countries taking measures to tighten their restrictions to ensure that they are able to bring down the numbers again. But as you heard from Stuart, the situation is not the same all over the UK, and Prime Minister Boris Johnson asking for a more regional approach, localised approach to the increasing numbers there.